All right. So we are ready to start our next unit, but I just wanted to congratulate you all on a great job. This is our best exam yet. Median was an 83.5 and the mean was also up in the BB minus range. So looking good, which means we want to finish strong. We're going to do even better for this final unit, all right, which is going to be our GI system and our reproductive systems. We're going to start with GI and think about eating, what we're doing when we eat food, break down that food, and then also how we get that food into our bodies so that we can actually use it to do stuff, to make stuff. You guys all have access to this? Is there a problem? Okay, cool. All right. So we're going to start with just the anatomy of the GI system, a little bit different than what you might be doing in lab, because we're also going to be talking about the tissue itself and its layers, right? So a big picture that we're trying to get to is we're trying to understand how it works, like how we consume food with these nutrients that are basically too big to pull into a cell, right? Like we can't pull our nutrients directly into the bloodstream, at least in the form we use them. We can't pull a chunk of taco into a cell, right? So we're going to need to digest our nutrients, digest our food as a whole. We're also going to then need to have different mechanisms for making sure that we can absorb that, making sure it comes into contact with our cells, that we pull it into the cells, also that we keep food moving, right? You don't want it ending up just kind of like stuck in your stomach forever. So we're also going to need to move these balls of food all the way through our digestive tract so that we can excrete them out and start this process over. Yep. So in order to understand digestion as a whole, we're going to be talking about the components of that gastrointestinal tract. So the course that food follows. And we're also going to need to understand a number of accessory organs. So we're basically going to be looking at a bunch of organs that make enzymes that help us break down that food, that help this process of digestion. So that's why there are kind of so many things going on in your abdomen. It's because we both have to move the food and we have to have these additional structures that help us with processing. So we're going to start out by thinking about that GI tract. So we're going to divide ourselves into GI tract, meaning that hollow tube that travels from your mouth. So starting with your mouth and chew the food with your teeth, right? Mix it up with some spit, swallow it down, ends up in your pharynx, right? As we go through the pharynx, we want to pass behind all our breathing apparatus. So we're passing posterior behind the trachea, the larynx, all that good stuff, moving into the esophagus. And so that's the next part of our tube. From the esophagus, we're traveling through the thorax, down, 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 going through your diaphragm, right? Through a hiatus, a hole in the diaphragm, ending up in your abdomen. In the abdomen is where you meet up with the stomach, which has a number of different parts and a number of different features that allow it to expand and contract and churn food around. We're going to see a lot of kind of chemical digestion happening in the stomach. And from the stomach, after we've churned stuff up a bunch, mixed in a bunch of enzymes and acids that we'll talk about, we're going to move into the small intestine. So the small intestine's small because it's thin, not because it's short, right? So our thinner tube there, we're going to move through the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum, the small intestine. Then we're moving to the large intestine, so our colon. We have an ascending, transverse, and descending colon. Then into the sigmoid colon, then the rectum, and out the anus as we're excreting, right? So basically pooping, right? Okay. As we flow through this tube, we're going to have accessory glands, so extra glands, neighboring a bunch of the different parts of this GI tract that are going to be secreting enzymes and other fluids. And when we say other fluids, one of the other things that we're going to pay particular attention to is like bicarbonate. We'll have some salts, right? But we're going to have to do some buffering action here in the GI tract as well. So stay tuned. Then we're going to secrete these enzymes. So take them out of the rest of the body, out of these accessory organs, and put them into the GI tract, where they help you digest the food as it continues along the way, and then out of your body. And so those are all the pieces that we're going to want to understand. In this figure, we've got the organs of the GI tract itself over here on the left. And we've got the major glands that we'll be talking about here on the right. Oh, I might have gotten right and left wrong, but you can see the labels. Okay. So for the GI tract itself, we're just being generic here. Right? What we're looking at is a slice through the whole wall of this tube, of this gut tube, we might refer to it as. Okay, so we got layers, which means we got different types of cells, different functions here. We're also going to have kind of some sub-layers to these pieces that we're going to be thinking about. So these are the main big layers, and then we'll get to some of the details. Okay, so lining the lumen of our GI tract. So the lumen, like when we've seen it before, lumen just means like hollow. So lumen is the hollow part inside the tube, right? So lining that lumen, we're going to see this first layer called the mucosa. So the mucosa lines the lumen. That's the part that's going to be our first layer out. If we're coming from the inside, or you swallowed food, moving out through the walls of our GI tract. Then next, we're going to hit the submucosa. So submucosa, to put those in order, think, right? Like you have to go from the perspective of a molecule, you'd be going through mucosa, then deeper as you get out of the gut tract, that would be the submucosa. Okay. This is largely going to be made up of connective tissue. Then we're going to hit a layer called the muscularis externa. So muscularis for muscle, externa for like external outside. So we're going to see a little bit of muscle earlier on, but this is our big layer of muscle lining the wall of the gut. Okay, so we'll see that muscularis externa is going to be made of smooth muscle. And then finally, we've got basically the slimy outside. The serosa is another layer of connective tissue. And this is the layer that you'd probably be touching in lab, right? It's nice and smooth and secreting some fluids to the outside there so that your different parts of, say, the small intestine can like rub against each other without friction as you swallow, and different parts of the gut are kind of like expanding and shrinking. You want to be able to have some smooth there. Okay. So those are our 4 big picture layers. Now we're going to talk about each of those in a little more detail. Before that, just from those layers themselves, which of those layers is going to be actually touching the food? Okay, take another couple seconds. Do. Okay, cool. Yeah, I put them here on this slide just in order of inside of the tube, outside of the tube, just like we're going to walk through them in that order. So that inner layer is the mucosa. And that inner layer is touching the lumen of the gut tube. So that hollow part, that lumen is where the food is traveling. So when we think about structures related to digestion and absorption, we're really going to be thinking about structures first in this mucosal layer. Okay, which is why we're going to be focusing on some of its subparts first. Okay, so the mucosal layer separating our lumen, so the tube, internal part of that tube, from what we consider our internal environment of the body. So if you remember way back to the beginning of A&P 1, we talked about internal environment and external environment, and we had that horrible like square picture of a human body. I say horrible because as an anatomist, really wanted a gingerbread person at a minimum. Okay. So anything that goes all the way through you is in communication with the outside of your body, counts as external, right? So because you're going from your mouth to the anus, we've got this hollow tube all the way through. The food in the tract, we're kind of thinking of as external, right? So it's like inside in terms of like, you can't see it, you can't touch it with your hands, but it hasn't been processed by the body. It's not like touching your blood or anything. So that's part of our external environment kind of. So we're separating anything that we're bringing in that way that might include like pathogens and stuff from the internal environment of our body. So we're thinking we're separating it from like our blood, our nerves, all our other organ tissues, right? Because we want to process that stuff first. So other external environments we saw were like the air in the alveoli in the lungs, or even in the urine in your bladder, since it's continuous with the outside environment. Okay, so the innermost layer of that mucosa is going to be the mucous membrane itself. So the mucosa is a mucous membrane. Okay. So that mucous membrane is going to have an epithelial lining. So we're going to have cells called enterocytes. Entero meaning kind of like inside, cytes meaning cells, right? These ones are going to be adapted for absorbing. And we're also going to have cells that are adapted for secreting stuff. So exocrine cells are going to be secreting a bunch of our enzymes, basically. And then our endocrine cells are doing a bunch of signal. So you actually have like some hormones and chemical signals that are coming from the gut itself. So if you think about like wanting to know that you're hungry, things like that, wanting to know that you need to store fat, things like that, right? That's going to have to communicate with the rest of the body. So that's what the endocrine cells are kind of doing here. Okay, so those are our kind of three functions of these enterocytes, which are specialized kind of types of epithelial cells. So we've got that epithelial lining here in the mucosa, that mucous membrane. Then we're going to have a layer called the lamina propria and a layer called the muscularis mucosae. Okay. All right. So the epithelial lining are these like little columnar cells. So that's where we're going to talk about absorptive function, enzymes, all that jazz. All right. Now that we're going into the lamina propria, still of this mucosal layer, basically we've got some connective tissue. Okay. We've got a lot of connective tissue connecting things. Okay. So embedded in that connective tissue of the lamina propria, we're going to have some small blood vessels. Right? We do want some blood flow. We want to have some function here. We're also going to have lymphatic vessels. So as we think about lymph, one thing that we commonly think about related to lymph is immune function, but we're going to see as we talk about lymph in this GI unit The lymphatic system is actually also going to be involved, in particular with fat absorption, so digestion of fats. We're going to see it's going to require lymphatic function. Okay, so those are in the lamina propria. We also have some nerves here, and we have some kind of extra dense pieces of lymph tissue here too. So we don't just have like lymphatic vessels. We really mean like little veins, except they're lymph, not part of your arteries and veins, not part of that part of the vasculature. But we also have these condensed pieces of lymphoid tissue also related to this symptom. So we've got lymph nodules, so like lymph nodes in here. And we also have these sort of sections called Peyer's patches here as well. So these are helpful because we're thinking about absorbing things, but we also want to make sure that we have at least some ability to combat any pathogens that are coming into the body, right? So we want that immune function as well in the GI tract. Okay. So we have that mucous membrane made up of those epithelial cells, the enterocytes, the lamina propria, which is connective tissue with a bunch of like lymph stuff embedded, some blood vessels, some nerves. Then we are still in the mucosa, going to have a very thin layer of smooth muscle. So this is why we had to have muscularis externa outside. That's why we needed to specify that it was external, because there's also this muscularis mucosae in this mucosal layer. So it's a thin layer of smooth muscle. Its fibers are longitudinal, so like lengthwise, right? So we're going to spend some time when we talk about motility and movement of food, thinking about like, okay, are we squeezing this stuff like a sphincter, or are we squeezing it kind of lengthwise? So we've got longitudinal muscle here, not circular muscle, when we are looking at this muscularis mucosae. First, and then we're also around that going to have circular fibers. So we've got like kind of a mix of both. And then that is going to have a fair amount of function when we talk about the motility in mixing the luminal contents. So we're going to both mix, and then we're also going to push. Okay. Motility is going to come after we talk about all the digestion and absorption stuff. So this will come back later. Okay. So from what we were talking about. So when we're talking about absorptive cells, where were those? What type of cells were those? All right, take another moment. Okay, yes. So the absorptive cells are part of that epithelial lining of the mucosa. So that first layer in, the innermost layer of the mucosa has these enterocytes. One of the types of those enterocytes in that epithelial lining is going to be cells adapted for absorption. Okay, so all of that stuff, all of those things were part of the mucosa, this inner layer, layer number one. Now we're stepping out again. Okay. So in the submucosa, we have another layer of connective tissue. It's thicker than we see in the lamina propria a little bit. What we think about when we think about the submucosa is we think about the fact that our gut tube has to be stretchy, right? And it has to be able to like expand and change shape as food is going through it, right? So distension, right? Like if you have a distended belly, it's like bulging out because you've got too much stuff in you, right? So that distensibility means that ability to change shape and kind of deform in response to having this contents inside. which is great, right? Like we want our belly to expand when we fill it with food. Yeah, otherwise it's going to come back up the other end. That's not good. Okay, so we want this distensibility, and we want this tissue to be elastic because we want it to bounce back, right? We want it to deform, and then once the food leaves, we want it to bounce back into place. Okay. So here in the submucosa, we're also going to have blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. They're going to be a little larger now. And here is where we're going to see a section of kind of named nerves. Like we're not going to name individual nerves, but we have a plexus here that is part of something called our enteric nervous system. So to do all this like digestion and signaling to the brain about hunger and all that good stuff, we have parts of the nervous system embedded in the GI tube. That's what the enteric nervous system is kind of doing. So the first part of this is in this submucosal layer. And specifically, it's a portion of the enteric nervous system called Meissner's plexus. And a plexus, just think like a tangled knot practically of nerves. So when you saw the brachial plexus in A&P 1, you learned some of its like branches and its structure. Here, we're definitely not doing that with Meissner's plexus. I don't know if anyone would go to that level of detail. I'm not sure how uniform it is from person to person. So we're just thinking lots of little nervelets kind of like mixing all together. Okay, so Meissner's plexus is part of the enteric nervous system in this submucosa. Okay. Now in the muscularis externa, right, we've got layers of smooth muscle. So before we had a little bit of longitudinal muscle and a little bit of circular muscle, thin in the muscularis mucosae and the mucosal layer. Now we've got chunkier muscle here in the muscularis externa. And this time we've got circular muscle and then longitudinal muscle, but these are much bigger now. Okay. So in the muscularis mucosae, we were thinking about churning. Now that we're in the muscularis externa, we can have like a bit more force. We're going to be thinking about the inner circular layer as like changing the diameter of the tube. So like controlling how much you're kind of squeezing on one little segment. And then that outer longitudinal layer is actually going to be able to kind of like scrunch your intestines up. So if you've ever tried to like force the string of a hoodie back through the lining of your hood or whatever, right? Like you can think of why you might want to change the length, right? Think about that tube that you're trying to put the string back in as your gut tube, right? So we're going to scrunch it, that longitudinal motion, partially in order to move food through. Okay. So that's happening in this muscularis externa layer. And then we have the other part of our enteric nervous system. So it's continuing, also embedded in the muscularis externa. So this is a plexus called Auerbach's plexus or the myenteric plexus. These are synonymous terms, right? So this my telling you it's in the muscle part. So the muscle part of the enteric nervous system, or naming it after someone who's good. Okay. So that's the muscularis externa. Now we have that final fourth layer, the serosa. Okay. So this is the part that you would be touching in lab when you're feeling the outside of the intestines. Okay. So on the inside of the serosa, we have, again, more connective tissue. But on the outer layer, we've got some epithelium again. So we have a layer of epithelium called really the mesothelium. And this is going to be continuous with our mesenteries, which are like those supportive structures going to the gut tube, right? So I don't know how to describe what they look like, but they look kind of foldy, kind of like fans, right? Connecting the small intestine to the posterior wall of the abdomen. We have a bunch of blood flow in there. We've got some nerves in there. In those mesenteries, connecting you to the peritoneum. The peritoneum is just that lining of the abdomen. Okay. So the serosa, we're really just thinking this kind of skin on the outside of the GI tract, right? It's not skin, but it's epithelium. Okay. So finishing up these layers for the enteric nervous system, which were the two layers that we found that in. All right, take another second or so. Okay, yeah. So the enteric nervous system, it's basically sandwiched kind of in the middle of these four layers, right? So we have it in the submucosa and the muscularis externa, which were layers 2 and 3 out of 4, right? So we don't have enteric nervous system in the mucosa layer directly touching the food. We don't have it in the serosa that's continuous with the lining of the walls of the abdominal cavity, but in both those kind of middle two layers, we do have parts of this nervous system. So it was Meissner's plexus in the submucosa and Auerbach's plexus in the muscularis externa. Okay. Cool. All right, so that was a generic section through the GI tract. Now we're just walking down through the tract itself. Okay, so we are starting in the mouth. You got teeth in your mouth. So that's actually beginning this digestive process. So when we're thinking digestion, we're really thinking about breaking down food. We're doing this both mechanically and chemically, right? So you're chewing, digesting. Mastication is another word for chewing, a more formal scientific word, okay? We're also secreting saliva into the mouth, right? So spit actually has function. Part of that is to lubricate your food. So when you swallow a bunch of food, you're swallowing, right, like tortilla chips, saltines, right? Like they're dry, they're potentially pointy, right? You want to protect your gut tube from it. You want things to move smoothly along. So we've got that lubrication from the saliva. And we actually have the beginning of the chemical digestion happening here as well. So in the saliva, we're going to start to break down carbohydrates, really. So we're going to have an enzyme called salivary amylase. So amylose is a type of carbohydrate. Salivary amylase digests starches and it digests glycogen, at least starting the process. Okay. So from the mouth, we're then in the pharynx. So basically just your throat, right? Pharynx, we're passing here from the laryngopharynx to this esophagus, right? So from the pharynx, from the throat, this is our common passageway for air and food, but we want to go behind our pathway for air, behind the trachea, behind the larynx as we move into the esophagus. So when we go into the esophagus, this is where we're actually going to start with the controlling of this pathway of food. So we have a sphincter here in the upper esophagus that contracts. So we can let food into the esophagus or not let food into the esophagus. So this upper esophageal sphincter is made up of skeletal muscle. Right? And we're specifying it's skeletal muscle because that means you can control it voluntarily, right? Skeletal muscle is the only type of muscle that you can control voluntarily, right? Our other two types, smooth muscle and your heart, right? Those are not under your fleshy voluntary control, right? So we can control whether we open our upper esophageal sphincter, which means we can control swallowing, basically, right? We have other neck muscles that are associated, but this upper esophageal sphincter is really part of the gut tube itself. Okay, So the esophagus itself is particularly muscular. So as we continue down through the thorax, we have a tube where we would really notice that kind of muscle layer on the outside of it. The upper third of the esophagus is going to be composed of skeletal muscle. But as we move downwards towards the abdomen, most of your esophagus, so approximately the lower 2/3, is made up of smooth muscle. So this is where we're transitioning to, you don't control this. This is not swallowing. This is now this kind of automatic, autonomic kind of function to your digestive process. Okay, so lower 2/3 is where we see this smooth muscle beginning, which means that by the time we get to our lower esophageal sphincter, which leads us into the stomach, this sphincter is now made of smooth muscle. Right, so upper esophageal sphincter, skeletal muscle under voluntary control. Lower esophageal sphincter going into your stomach. You're not controlling that. It's made of smooth muscle, but it's important because it's letting food flow smoothly and in a relatively controlled way into the body of the stomach. And also, it's very helpful to have a sphincter here, right? Because you don't want food to kind of come back up the other way, right? When your stomach is really full, ideally you don't have that super acidic stomach contents coming back into your esophagus. If you do, that's part of like why you make it heartburn. So from the esophagus and that lower esophageal sphincter, we're making our way into the stomach. This is where we are storing our food, okay? So when your stomach is empty, it should be about 50 milliliters large in terms of its contents. When it's full, you can contain up to about 1,000 milliliters within the stomach. So like a liter, basically, of stomach contents here. The reason it can expand like this is it has rugae. Okay, rugae is just a word that like means wrinkles. So these are the folds of your stomach. If you look at the stomach, if you open it up and look at that tissue, it's going to look like wrinkles in the wall of the stomach. That's very helpful because those wrinkles pull open and expand as the stomach gets bigger. So again, we got this kind of fan-like action for the wall of the stomach. Now, the walls of the stomach, in addition to just holding your food, are going to have digestive actions and some protective action. Okay. So we're going to see the walls of the stomach going to have these glands within them that secrete gastric juices. So we can see here in the walls of the stomach, we've got these pits, these gastric pits that take you down into glandular tissue, right? So in this glandular tissue, we can see we've got all sorts of different cell types. We're going to have chief cells that are going to secrete pepsinogen, and we'll talk about that when we talk about protein digestion. We have these cells called parietal cells that secrete acid. So literally the hydrochloric acid, creating a really acidic environment in the stomach. It's part of the protective function of your body, as well as activating a bunch of enzymes that we need later on. All right, so that's our gastric juices. Right, so stomach acid, stomach juice, it has stuff in it coming out of these gastric pits. Okay. Your stomach is also going to have muscle in it that allows it to contract, allows it to wiggle around, allows it to move around, right? And what it's doing as it does that is it's mixing this gastric juice full of acid and pepsinogen, so some of these precursor enzymes that are going to be involved in the digestive process, mixing them all together and basically making kind of a smoothie, right? And that smoothie, it's called chyme. So it's the food that you've chewed up, swallowed, mixing with those gastric juices. And that chyme, that smoothie-like stuff, is what's going to pass out of your stomach. So coming out of the stomach, right? So passing from the body into the antrum and out the pylorus, which has a sphincter as well, a pyloric sphincter. So again, we have some control here of things coming out of the stomach, just like we had control of what's in the stomach versus what's in the esophagus. All right, so we're going to slowly release this chyme from the stomach into our small intestine at a decently slow enough rate that we're going to be able to absorb and continue to digest that stomach contents. Let's zoom in again, just on those gastric pits. Now we've got it out in words, right? Right. So those gastric pits were in the lining of the stomach. So you can see that this is actually really kind of folds in that mucosal layer, right, of the GI tract. So we weren't seeing a cut through the stomach specifically, but we can see how this is a kind of adaptation of that same kind of construction that we see in our generalized GI tract cross section. So here we see that mucosal layer going from the gastric pit down into a little neck. Okay, so in these neck cells, we're also going to be secreting mucus, right? And as we get down into the depths here of our gastric pits, that's where we see the secretory products, right? So our chief cells with their pepsinogen. Here we have written out what that does. So that inogen ending, right, should indicate to you, like when we were thinking about our all our various things that the liver is producing and putting in plasma, basically, right? So all those clotting factors, parts of our RAS system, right? We saw that inogen ending means something has to be activated, right? So pepsinogen coming from those chief cells is going to get activated, and it's going to turn into pepsin when it does. And that pepsin is one of our enzymes that's going to digest proteins. So that's how we're going to start breaking up our proteins. The hydrogen ions are coming from our parietal cells. So the neighboring parietal cells, we can see, are the ones in purple. Okay, so those are maintaining that acidic environment. Remember, lots of hydrogen ions means a low pH, means acidity. Okay, we like our stomach to be acidic because this is actually helping activate our pepsinogen, and it's giving us some kind of immune function. It's helping with digestion. It's doing a lot of stuff. Okay. Also coming from those parietal cells is something not included on this figure called intrinsic factor. So intrinsic factor is a molecule that helps you absorb vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is important for the normal function of your body, right? We needed a bunch of B vitamins when we were talking about like the creation of like red blood cells, stuff like that. Right? So we need that for creating new cells. So the intrinsic factor is also coming from those parietal cells. Okay. Gastrin is a hormone, so that would be part of this like endocrine function. So gastrin comes from G cells, which would also be located in these gastric pits, but I don't see them specifically marked on this particular diagram, but they're in there. We've got some G cells, and they're going to produce gastrin, this hormone going into the bloodstream, right? So hormones, part of the endocrine system, really what that means is we have signaling going through the blood. So that's going to be part of this overall control of your body, telling you what's going on with your nutritional state, telling you, do you have food in your stomach or do you not have food in your stomach, right? So that's part of what those G cells and the gastrin are doing. Finally, we do have cells that are basically protecting the lining of your stomach from how acidic that environment gets. So in the neck cell, we have mucus secretion itself. So we're going to have a nice mucus lining to the walls of the stomach, basically, so it doesn't digest itself, right? Because it's got this acid coming out, all these hydrogen ions. You've got this pepsinogen, which digests proteins ultimately when it turns into pepsin. You don't want to start digesting the walls of the stomach. So we keep that mucus layer kind of lining up top here on the mucosa. Okay. In terms of exactly how acidic it gets down there, we get to a pH of 2, which is quite low. All right. If our blood were at a pH of 2, we would absolutely die. So good to keep this acidity in the stomach, keep that controlled, right? This pH is necessary for activating pepsinogen. right? So that pepsinogen coming from those chief cells gets secreted up into the stomach, right? So think like we're in the body of the stomach or something here, right? Pepsinogen is inactive, it's not working yet. That pH, though, that really low pH, changes its shape, activates it, turns it into pepsin. The acidity itself, why it can turn pepsinogen into pepsin is because pH changes the conformation of proteins, so it changes the shape of proteins because those R groups like have chemical properties, right? So in addition to changing pepsinogen into pepsin, it also denatures proteins in general. So by denature, we mean we're like unfolding it. So our proteins are coming in all folded into their tertiary and then quaternary structures. They hit this super low pH in the stomach and they unfold, which is great because once we have like just a long polypeptide chain, we could start to attack those bonds between the amino acids. When they're all folded up in a big bundle, that would be harder to reach the bonds to actually break them up. This is also part of why it's able to kill bacteria, right? This acidic environment really just changes all sorts of chemical functioning, right? So kills bacteria as well, or at least a lot of them. And then we have this gastric mucosal barrier protecting us from this acidic environment. So we've got the mucus, so the slimy stuff coming from these neck cells. And we've also got bicarbonate mixed in that mucus. So that sticky mucus isn't mixing into the chyme much. It's kind of staying on the tissue layer. But the bicarbonate means that when those hydrogen ions hit the wall of the stomach, they can get kind of buffered out and not actually impact your cells lining the stomach. There is another type of cell in there as well called goblet cells that are also involved in producing this gastric mucosal barrier, right? And letting us have this bicarbonate and mucus in the wall. From the stomach, we're going through that pyloric sphincter into our small intestine. And specifically, the first part we're going to hit is this kind of C-shaped duodenum, right? So we're going to go through 3 divisions, the duodenum, then the jejunum, and then the ileum before we get into the large intestine, the colon. Okay. The small intestine, its big job is absorption. So this is really where you're absorbing your nutrients. You don't even need your whole small intestine for this. You only need about 20% of it. So that absorption is going to happen really quick. And then we've kind of got like backup as we continue further down the small intestine, right? So this was just how we saw that a lot of gas exchange in the lungs, right, happened in just the first parts of the capillary beds touching the alveoli, right? We've got extra surface area here to kind of control this. So the small intestine is so long, like 8 to 10 feet, in part so that we have more surface area for absorption available. That's why we have all these kind of like folds and stuff. Okay. So this is where absorption is happening. This is also where digestion is happening, right? So we haven't fully digested food when it leaves the stomach, right? So we've mixed in pepsinogen, converted it to pepsin, done some, like a little bit of protein digestion, denatured those proteins. We had a little bit of salivary amylase doing a little bit of carbohydrate digestion, but not all our molecules are like small enough yet to cross the walls of your cell, or I should say the membranes of your cells, right? So we're going to continue to see enzymes being poured into the small intestine, allowing this digestive process to continue. So if we look at the small intestine specifically and its wall, it's going to look slightly modified from our generalized GI cross-section. Right, so we still have mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and serosa, right? So the 4 main layers are still the same. But we can see that that mucosa in particular looks different, right? So like we saw differences in the nephron between the cells in the proximal tubule versus the distal tubule in terms of like their surface area, we see the same thing happening here. The small intestine has now, instead of microvilli, which is what it would be if it was on the cell level, now we have these big villi, so these big projections of the mucosa, further increasing the surface area of the small intestine. Now, these villi are going to have blood flow in them. So we're going to have capillaries, we're going to have arterial coming in, a venule going out, and we have parts of our lymphatic system going in as well. So here we can see a lymphatic duct, and here we see structure called a lacteal coming in. So part of that lymphatic system as well. All right, zooming in on one of the cells in the villi, we would have microvilli as well. So like we've got like kind of a fractal pattern here. We've got villi with microvilli, more and more and more surface area as we're thinking about this inner layer of the small intestine. And all of this is just making sure that we can absorb as much of the nutrition coming from our food as possible. Okay. Now, this is also part of where we're going to have, we'll just finish this last paragraph, sorry. This is also part of where we have some secretions going on. So in between those villi, we see crypts. So these dug out kind of holes here. These are the crypts of Lieberkühn. They're epithelial cells, and they're secreting bicarbonate, particularly in the proximal small intestine. So the first parts, so that stomach acid coming through in the chyme is immediately kind of buffered out and doesn't mess with your small intestine as well. Okay, so we'll pick up with the small intestine next time.